You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Hello, and welcome to episode 324 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In 1609, the Dutch East India Company employed an English adventurer by the name of Henry Hudson, and they employed Hudson to find them a sea route to East Asia by going around the northern reaches of Scandinavia. Now, Hudson did his best. He sailed up to Scandinavia and found that the sea was just too frozen for him to make any progress. But rather than go back to the Netherlands empty-handed, Hudson sailed his 85-foot-long vessel, the De Havilman, across the Atlantic Ocean. And during his explorations for a passage to the Pacific Ocean through North America, Hudson entered what is now New York Harbor and sailed north along the river that has come to bear his name. Hudson kept a journal of his voyage up and down what is now the Hudson River. He noted that many indigenous peoples lived along the river, that the river was tidal. He even noted that the river seemed to have an infinite number of fish. And when Hudson arrived around the area that is now present-day Albany, New York, he commented about how the area seemed to just teem with peltry and furs. So after Henry Hudson returned to the Netherlands and circulated his journal, Dutch traders started making a point of venturing across the Atlantic Ocean to the area that the Dutch were now calling New Netherland. In 1614, they founded a trading post near Albany, New York. And in 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a settlement at New Amsterdam, what is now present-day Manhattan and New York City. So how did the colony of New Netherland take shape? In what ways did the Dutch West India Company and private individuals use enslaved labor to develop this colony? Andrea Masterman, an associate professor of history at the University of New Orleans, is a scholar of the Dutch Atlantic world and of slavery. She joins us today to lead us on an exploration of what life was like in New Netherland and early New York, especially for the enslaved who did so much to build this Dutch and later English colony. Using details from her book, Spaces of Enslavement, Andrea reveals information about the establishment of New Netherland, its geographic scope, and its place within the larger Dutch Atlantic world, Dutch involvement in the African slave trade, and the origins of slavery in colonial New Netherland and New York, and myth versus reality when it comes to the history and lived experiences of enslaved New Yorkers during the Dutch and the English colonial periods. But first, if you enjoy our explorations of early America, you might also really enjoy participating in the Poor Richard's Book Club. This is a listener-created and listener-led reading group for listeners of Ben Franklin's World. The Poor Richard's Book Club meets once a week on Tuesday nights in the United States and on Wednesday mornings in Australia, so participants can gather and discuss chapters or selections from a book that they selected to read. Most of the books are those that we've discussed on this podcast or will discuss on this podcast. And group leaders Shari and Heather really do their best to take this discussion beyond the podcast. They invite guest experts to come and discuss their weekly readings with you. The Poor Richard's Book Club is free to join. To learn more about it, visit benfranklinsworld.com/book club. That's benfranklinsworld.com/book club. Ben je klaar om Nieuw Nederland te bezoeken? That's Dutch for Are you ready to visit New Netherland? I hope you're ready, because it's now time to meet our guest historian. Our guest is an associate professor in Atlantic history at the University of New Orleans. She's an award-winning educator and a historian of the Dutch Atlantic world and early New York who specializes in the history of slavery. She's curated the digital exhibit Slavery in New Netherland for the New Netherland Institute, and she's written an award-winning book, Spaces of Enslavement, A History of Slavery and Resistance in Dutch New York, which won the 2020 Hendricks Award for the best book-length manuscript related to New Netherland and the Dutch colonial experience. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Andrea Masterman.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's really wonderful being here. Very excited.
And we're excited to have you, Andrea, to talk about the history of New Netherland and the history of early New York. You know, and in that vein, I wonder if we could start with having you tell us a bit about why the Dutch established the colony of New Netherland.
Yeah, of course. There's a lot going on in the 17th century Atlantic world, and the Dutch are a very prominent part of that. When we look at New Netherland and really their involvement in that area, we see this really begin in 1609 with the exploration of Henry Hudson, who at that time is working for the Dutch East India Company and is trying to find a passageway to the east via North America. Now, he travels up the river that now holds his name, returns to the Netherlands, and with the information that he's returning to the Netherlands, there's a lot of interest in establishing commerce in that area, especially the fur trade. So we see that initially the Dutch are really establishing predominantly trade ports along what is now the Hudson River and trade with the indigenous people in that region. It's not until the Dutch West India Company takes over in the 1620s that we see a more concerted effort to actually colonize the region. And it becomes then not just an important trading colony, but also strategically, with it really being in between New England and Virginia. It's a very important colony in that sense, also for geopolitics, if you will.
So just like the Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, South America, and even along the African coast, New Netherland was really established as a trade colony, a place of trade.
Yes, absolutely. It's a place of trade. It also becomes an important place of cultivating various grains. It's a very fertile grounds. And they talk about this in the Netherlands too, and trying to promote the area. But especially during those early years, the fur trade is really what catches the attention of the Dutch and makes it a very valuable colony and very different also from the colonies more toward the south, because of course there you don't have the access to the same types of furs like the beaver pelts that become so important and popular as you would have in North America and the New York region.
Could you tell us a bit more about the geography and geographic scope of New Netherland? You mentioned its placement, is really important because it's between New England and Virginia, and this is important for the world of geopolitics. But I'm also curious about the size of the colony, because I think when most of us hear New Netherland, our minds really just tend to picture early New York. But if we look at New Netherland on a map, it was really more and much larger than just early New York.
It definitely was. What's interesting is that the Dutch, as do many Europeans at the time, they claim a vast area that really is what today would be New York, New Jersey. It really extends all the way to the Delaware, in fact, at some point. So it's a vast geographic area. Now, what's important to keep in mind, though, is that technically the Dutch don't actually control all that territory. And most of the settlements are really along the Hudson River. There's a settlement by the Delaware. There's a few other places, but it's not nearly as large as the area they claim to actually control.
So what was the area that the Dutch actually controlled in their claimed vast colony of New Netherland?
So the main settlements are, of course, New Amsterdam, which founded in 1625 in the southernmost point of Manhattan. Western Long Island is an important Dutch region that the Dutch are increasingly colonizing. And then along the Hudson River, the area that is now Kingston, Wildwijk, became an important settlement. And of course, what today is Albany, New York, Fort Orange, and Beverwijk in the Dutch colonial period. Those were some of the main settlements. And then in Delaware, it would be Fort Casimir. It's another location where the Dutch, after they took this over from Sweden, really tried to settle in the 1650s and the 1660s.
You mentioned earlier that the governance of New Netherland really fell to the Dutch West India Company by the 1620s. Could you tell us about the Dutch West India Company and about the company's role in developing and governing this vast colony of New Netherland?
So the Dutch West India Company was founded in 1621. It is appointed by the Staten-Generaal, the States General, to govern this colony. So it is in control over a lot of the legislative and political management of the area. Interestingly, New Netherland actually is combined with the islands in the Caribbean, the Dutch islands in the Caribbean. So the Director General of New Netherland, so for example, in the 1650s and 1660s, we see Peter Stuyvesant very famously as the Director General or Governor of New Netherland. He is also in charge of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao. So they are one unit. And the Dutch West India Company then is the one who appoints such a director general. They take care of a lot of the day-to-day business, and they have the council in the colony that is in charge of really managing the day-to-day happenings, if you will.
A lot of colonies in North America were founded by for-profit companies, where stockholders in England and France or the Netherlands would purchase stock in a colonization company with the hope that they would actually turn a profit from the business of colonization. Was this the case with the Dutch West India Company as well? Was the Dutch West India Company a for-profit company? Or was it really just a government entity that was used to govern the affairs of Dutch claimed territories in the Atlantic world?
That is such a great question. There's a lot going on when it comes to the Dutch West India Company. It's really founded in part to gain Dutch control, to fight the war against the Spanish and Portuguese, to really, as a part of that, also expand the Dutch Empire. So one of the things that actually is part of the Dutch West India Company that's oftentimes forgotten is that they are supposed to also settle these areas, colonize territories. It's oftentimes portrayed as a predominantly commercial company, but that is not really the case. It's very much also created out of wartime efforts as a way to expand the Dutch Empire in the Atlantic world, kind of as a counterpoint to the Dutch East India Company in some ways. And this is where we see then that the colonization in New Netherland, and at some point it takes over Dutch Brazil, like it takes over Brazil from the Portuguese and names it Dutch Brazil or New Holland, Luanda in the 1640s, Elmina in, I believe it was 1639. So it really also is focused on expanding. And that has to do with very much the competition and the continued war against the Spanish.
That's a really interesting and very important point that we really need to consider when we think about Dutch colonial history, is that the backdrop of Dutch colonization and Dutch imperial expansion is really the Dutch Republic's war for independence from Spain during the 80 Years' War.
Yes, it is. And there's some really interesting literature on that talks about this and how the Dutch envisioned themselves as, for example, in America, as freeing indigenous populations from the yoke of the Spanish as they had just freed themselves from Spanish control. So it really was very important, not just on a practical matter and how they approached this, but also on a philosophical, how they really thought about expansion and colonization and their role in the Atlantic world.
Now, slavery played a pretty big role in Dutch colonization efforts, especially in the Atlantic world and in New Netherland. And Lydia and Marcus would like to know more about Dutch involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Lydia wonders when and why the Dutch entered the African slave trade, and Marcus would like to know just how early Dutch involvement in this trade began.
So this is a gradual process, and it initially is predominantly through privateering, that the Dutch capturing ships that hold enslaved people on them, these predominantly would be Portuguese ships. And so much of it initially is just part of some of the other things that they're doing within the Atlantic, and perhaps even accidental in some cases. It's really when they capture Brazil that slavery becomes a more important and prominent role of the Dutch in the Atlantic world. And that expands after their capture of Elmina and especially Luanda, which at that time was known to actually export thousands of people from West Central Africa to the Americas and Brazil in particular. It's interesting, though, because this happens in 1641 that they capture Luanda. But 20 years before that, there had already been an opportunity, correspondence from the King of Congo, who actually tried to create an alliance with the Dutch to fight the Portuguese. And as part of that, he promised Luanda to them, in which he actually, in correspondence to the Staten-Generaal, claimed that at that time, there were already about 20,000 people who were exported from that area. And the Dutch probably would have acted upon that if that correspondence hadn't arrived too late for them to actually do so. So I think that in some ways, they probably would have been more actively involved earlier if they had a chance to do so. But really, by the 1630s and 1640s, we see the Dutch are very actively involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And this continues throughout the 17th century.
A lot of European empires, I'm thinking about Spain, France, England, or Great Britain, depending on the period that you're talking about, seem to have participated in the slave trade by primarily trading for enslaved people that they could then bring back to their respective colonies, so they could help build those colonies. But the Dutch were known for another type of Atlantic development in that they were establishing free ports. Think of St. Eustatius, which we talked about in episode 161 in the Caribbean, or even New Netherland, which we're talking about here in North America. The Dutch established free ports throughout the Atlantic world because they were interested in profiting from the colonial experiment, not just from Dutch colonists, but from all colonists. So was the Dutch approach to this slave trade similar in this regard, in that the Dutch really didn't just trade for enslaved people to bring back to their colonies, but really traded for enslaved people that they could bring to these free ports like St. Eustatius and, sell across the Atlantic world?
Absolutely. They actually, by the 1660s, they have this agreement with these Genoese merchants who hold the Spanish asiento. And as part of that, they agree to shipping thousands of enslaved Africans that they will then be passed on to the Spanish colonies. And this is what actually leads to the development of Curacao as what oftentimes is referred to as a slave depot, where the Dutch are importing enslaved people from Africa, keep them there for a short while so that they can regain their strength, their health, because many of them are very ill by the time they arrive in the Caribbean. And then from there are being shipped to the Spanish colonies. Interestingly, we also see in New Netherland that when the ship at Witte Paard, which is in fact the ship with the largest number of enslaved people to arrive in North America, over 300 people who arrived on that ship. Those people, many of them were transported into the Chesapeake area. So we even in that region in New Netherlands see that it's not just that these people are imported to work in the Dutch colony, but also are actually part of a larger trade networks.
Now, your book, Spaces of Enslavement, investigates the spaces inhabited by enslaved people in colonial New Netherland, specifically in the part of New Netherland that we now think of as early New York. Andrea, when and how did slavery make its way to early New York? How did it make its way from the larger Dutch Atlantic world to its colony in New Netherland?
It starts with the arrival of a group of enslaved men. One of them very likely is Manuel de Gerrit de Reus from Angola. Simon Congo is another one of these men who very likely was there amongst the very first ones to have been brought there. And this was around 1627 that we know that they were in that area. In 1628, we know that there are enslaved women in the region. One of them is Maiken van Angola, also from Angola. And this is very interesting when looking at that early period, that we really see that a lot of the people are coming from West Central Africa. So Congo, Ndongo, Angola. They are the very first people to arrive in this area. They're all enslaved by the Dutch West India Company, and they labor for the Dutch West India Company. The population obviously increases over time, and there's also more individuals who over time are enslaving people. But predominantly, the enslaved population is working for the Dutch West India Company. This is, to me, really interesting when thinking about New Netherland and New York. As a Dutch person growing up in the Netherlands, I oftentimes heard the stories of how the Dutch used to own New York and how Petrus Stuyvesant, was this amazing governor. And again, real pride in having been the first people to settle this area. What never was told was that enslaved people were a huge part of that. And that is something that I really did not learn until much later.
It's really interesting to think about how the Dutch West India Company was the owner of a lot of enslaved people, that it was the primary enslaver in early New York. And I'm wondering how the experience of being a company-owned enslaved person differed from the experience of an enslaved person who was owned by just a private person, an individual enslaver.
In the case of New Netherland, what really is different is the labor they used to build the infrastructure of the colony. So they are the ones who dig the canal, help build the forest areas, and so forth. They also help protect the colony. So there's actually enslaved people who fight in the Second Aesopus War, for example. There is a real difference from how individual enslavers, in most cases, they would have the people they enslave either help them with their trade or work on the land or work in domestics. So the labor was very different. Also, the way in which they labored. We know that the people enslaved by the company, there are several references to them working in chain gangs. And at some point, that actually becomes a punishment in the colony to work alongside the company slaves in the chain. So the way they labored is also different. Another thing that really distinguishes them in that sense is that because they're many, whereas individual enslavers would oftentimes have only a few people that they held in bondage, we see that they are able to build a community in a way that was really unprecedented in some ways. They are initially living in houses in what was then a very forested area, which I estimate to be around East 74th Street. And by the 1640s, they're moved into New Amsterdam. They live in a few different homes, but at some point they live in the house at the Slijksteeg, which today would be South William Street. So most of them would share that space. They would share that home. And that, I think, was a big part of them being able to create a community. They intermarried, they had children, they had other people enslaved by the company serve as witnesses of their marriages and witnesses of the baptisms of their children at the Dutch Reformed Church. And so this was a thing that really distinguishes also the people who were enslaved by the company. And this also allowed them to really petition for their freedom and reach out to the company and demand certain things from the company, I think because they already had that relationship with the Dutch West India Company.
I realized that the New York case, especially with the West India Company enslaved people and their ability to form their own community, was unprecedented in this early period of North America. But there's also aspects of the New York story that sound pretty familiar because in episode 170, we spoke with Wendy Warren, and she also told us how early New Englanders used enslaved labor to clear the land of New England and make it ready for the work of colonization and farming. And it sounds like the Dutch West India Company was pretty much doing the same thing in terms of using enslaved labor to build infrastructure at the same time that this is happening in the English colonies of New England.
Absolutely. That was a big part of what they were doing.
Now, what about the enslaved people who lived and worked outside of New Amsterdam, outside of what we now think of as New York City? What was their life and work like elsewhere in this colony of New Netherland? What was it like for them to be enslaved by either private individuals or by the Dutch West India Company in these smaller locations, in like Beverswijk or present-day Albany?
When we look at people enslaved by the companies, they would have predominantly been close to the forts, working there, also, again, helping build these forts and the various infrastructure. And really, when we look at just the labor, it would have been the same for the people enslaved by individuals. What I think is very distinct, though, is that there would have been fewer of them. So, for example, there's this case in Albany, New York, North Beverwijk. There's an enslaved woman who she steals some goods from the person who holds her in bondage. And when she testifies before the court or the council, she explains that she did this in part because she was promised by the people that she gave these goods to her, that she stole these goods for. She was promised to be brought to New Amsterdam and that she could have a family there. And that case really stood out to me because I think it really speaks to the isolation that some of these enslaved people must have had in these regions where there really was not a substantial enslaved African population. So I think that that is what makes their experiences very different from the enslaved people in New Amsterdam.
A fascinating aspect of slavery in New Netherland that I found while reading your book, Spaces of Enslavement, is that if you were enslaved by the Dutch West India Company, you could petition the company for a status called half freedom. Andrea, what was the status of half freedom and what was the level of actual freedom that it provided to the enslaved New Netherlanders who were able to obtain this status?
So half freedom has been used by scholars over the years to refer to these various people who were able to obtain a conditional freedom. And the first case that we see this happening is in 1644, when 11 enslaved men, and among them are Manuel de Gerrit de Reus and Simon Congo, so really the first people to have been brought to the colony, they petition to the council for their freedom. And the council grants them that freedom, but under certain conditions. And in fact, it's not just them, their wives also gain this conditional freedom. And these 11 couples then are given land in Manhattan, north of New Amsterdam, but they are still required to pay the company a yearly fee. They also have to assist the company whenever it needs them. And their children, including the ones who were not yet born, would remain in some form of bondage. The council refers to it as lijfeigenen, which would be the Dutch word for serfs. There's another document in which they are referred to as slaves. So their status is a little complicated and unclear. The secretary of the colony later on in 1650 claims that most of them are not really working for the company, that most of them are living with their families, but they could be, of course, claimed to perform labor for the company at any time because they were not freed. So that's the 1644 case, and that's really the most famous one. But there are a few other cases. In 1662, for example, in December of that year, Maiken van Angola, whom I mentioned earlier, who was one of the first enslaved women in the colony, she petitions for her freedom together with two other women, Susanna and Lucrezia, and they get a conditional freedom as well. This time, the condition is that they return weekly to clean the house of Peter Stuyvesant. And it's really within just a few months, I believe in April of 1663, that Maiken van Angola returns to the council and requests to be fully freed this time because the other two women had since passed away. And this is just within a span of 3 months or 4 months or so. The other women had passed away and she was old, tired. She had an injury that was chronic that made it very hard for her to actually perform that work of cleaning his house weekly all by herself. And she is then granted a full freedom. And then there's one other case, and this is actually the case where the council actually uses the terms of half free. They don't do that in the other cases. But in this particular case, it's in 1663, a group of men get their freedom. This time, the condition is that they return to work for the company every other month. So they have 1 month to work on their own land, 1 month to work for the Dutch West India Company. And they eventually, that is in December of 1663, it goes into effect in January of 1664. When the English arrive in the harbor of New Amsterdam, they return to the council in September of 1664 and they petition to be freed fully because in part they're worried that the English might re-enslave them. And they do at that point get full freedom.
I'm glad you brought up the English conquest of 1664, which is the event that led to the English taking over New Netherland and to the name change. That's when New Netherland becomes New York. Andrea, how did New Netherland's system of slavery change under English rule? We have been talking about how the Dutch West India Company had these expectations that enslaved people would do the work of colonization, such as clearing lands, creating infrastructure, and even cleaning the governor's house. But the West India Company's enslaved people also had some autonomy. They were able to live together north of New Amsterdam, sometimes with that status of half freedom. Was this status of half freedom something that the English maintained when they took over control of the colony? Did they allow early New York's enslaved people to continue to have that degree of freedom and autonomy?
What we see happening in the latter part of the 17th century is that slavery really does change in this region. I don't know if this has anything to do with the English conquest. And that's the big question that always kind of comes up because it coincides with this change in regime, really. But we see similar changes happening in other colonies. We see similar changes happening in Virginia, for example. Slavery definitely does change. And this is in part, I think, because there is increased regulation of enslaved people. There's also the population grows, the free settler population grows, but also with that, slavery expands and it becomes increasingly racialized. This causes significant changes in what slavery looks like. So most of the people in the latter part of the 17th century then are enslaved by individuals. We see that there's legislation that limits their movements, their activities, and these are really important changes. But again, I don't know if that has to do with the English conquest, because in some ways we see some of this already starting in the 1660s, slowly but surely, and it just extends after the Dutch lose the colony.
One fascinating aspect of Andrea's book, Spaces of Enslavement, is that Andrea addresses head-on this myth that exists about slavery in New Netherland and early New York. Curious what this myth is? We'll have Andrea tell us right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. How did Black people sustain their vision for freedom through the rise of Jim Crow? In the second season of Seizing Freedom, Dr. Kidada E. Williams will join a host of artists, intellectuals, and activists to explore answers to this question. The first African-American generation after emancipation really had to grapple with the lessons passed down to them after Reconstruction. Should they turn inward and form their own institutions? Or should they continue to push for their constitutionally enshrined equality? Should they continue to remain living in the South? Or should they move to the North or West? Seizing Freedom's 8 narrative episodes in Season 2 will show how individuals and groups wrestled with these questions, and how they laid the foundation for the burgeoning civil rights movement. And complementary interview episodes discuss how the legacy of this time period in United States history still impacts the nation today. Seizing Freedom is a co-production of Virginia Public Media and Molten Heart. You can listen to Season 2 of Seizing Freedom wherever you get your podcasts. For listeners who served or worked with the United States Marine Corps, or who may have friends and family who might have, I'd like to notify you about an available resource. From 1953 to 1987, personnel who were assigned to Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune were potentially exposed to contaminated drinking water. Now, the Marine Corps has since partnered with health agencies to conduct scientific studies to assess impacts from these potential exposures. And they're working to keep those Marines, their families, and civilian employees informed with updates and resources available to them. If you or someone you know may have been at Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987, please consider registering with the Camp Lejeune Historic Drinking Water Notification Database. You can register and learn more at marines.mil/CL water. That's marines.mil/CL water. Andrea, you write in your book, Spaces of Enslavement, that there is a myth that slavery in New Netherland and early New York was somehow more benevolent and kind than slavery elsewhere in British North America and the early United States. Would you tell us about this myth, how it developed, and why it has lingered for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is very persistent, and it really continues in the scholarship up until very recent. So it is not just something that we see at the time. It's something that historians oftentimes have continued to say. And one of the reasons why I think this became so influential and so prevalent for New York is that the fact that enslaved people oftentimes lived in the same homes as their enslavers, worshipped in the same churches, worked alongside their enslavers, that is oftentimes very hard for people to comprehend, that just because they might be living in the same home, that their experiences in those homes were extremely different, and that they not inhabited the same spaces, as was the case with the churches. Like, you might be worshiping in a Dutch Reformed church, but if you were an enslaved person, you would be doing so in the far back, and you would not be holding communion in most cases with the white congregants. You would have to wait until after they had finished their communion. But because the way it is explained is that they shared these spaces, it is very difficult for people to really understand that that does not mean that it was not a very brutal system. And this is, of course, also very much in comparison to the images that often come to mind of slavery in the United States, in the South, and then the North, of course, being this free area. So I think that that also helped them kind of embrace this idea that they were, in fact, anti-slavery. And if there was slavery in New York, then it wasn't as bad. You know, it was more benign. So it was very pervasive way of thinking about slavery. And I think we really need to rewrite the history of slavery in New York to show that that is absolutely incorrect.
Did you find any evidence to suggest that this myth of benevolent slavery was perhaps developed by people in the 19th century who were trying to fondly remember the Dutch period? And I ask this because As you know, I've also done a lot of research about early New York. And in one of the sources I found, there was a source from the late 18th century where someone, it was probably Elkanah Watson, he said, here in New England, we would threaten our enslaved people with sale to New York enslavers because we believe that New York enslavers wouldn't hesitate to separate families and they wouldn't hesitate to sell misbehaving enslaved people down into the plantation slavery of the Caribbean. So in this recounting, right, it's New England rather than New York that has a practice of benevolent slavery. So I'm just curious what you found in the archive.
So yes, and yes. Interestingly, during the era of slavery in New York, we see similar references to people actually threatening to send their enslaved person to the English colonies because they portray the English as being more cruel enslavers. But in the conclusion of my book, I refer to James Fenimore Cooper's Satan's Toe, in which he describes slavery in New York and really portrays it in that way of they lived in the same homes and they were as part of a common family. And I do think that this is something that became more prevalent in the 19th century. And this all relates to, I think, the increasing paternalistic approach to slavery and enslavement. And of course, also the fact that New York at that point was really trying to align themselves more with abolitionism. And so how do you explain that you really, for 2 centuries, had enslaved people within your own homes, the homes that many of these people were still living in? How do you explain that? And then also are able to portray yourself as an abolitionist or a free state that really is fighting slavery and that portrays slavery as this evil system when it's in the South? Well, then you also have to be able to make the argument that in the North, maybe it wasn't that bad.
What's really interesting as we compare our research notes here is how the people in each colony were saying, no, we're kind enslavers. It's the enslavers in these other colonies and other states that you really have to worry about. And it just seems really interesting to me that this early on in the 17th and 18th centuries, we see colonists having these kinds of ideas and debates about which colony had the most brutal enslavers and which colony had the most benevolent enslavers, which, as you said, didn't really lessen the harshness of slavery for the enslaved.
This is very prevalent, actually. We see this everywhere, even in Louisiana. I live in Louisiana, New Orleans. And when you visit the plantation museums here, at least a few decades ago, they would always talk about, well, this enslaver was good to the people they held in bondage in comparison to maybe their neighbors. Or the French were better than the Spanish. Here, they always like to refer to the Code Noir and that made for a more benign system of slavery. So I think that this was very common more generally.
Now, I'd like for us to dig further into this idea of benevolent slavery by turning back to your work in early New York and your book, Spaces of Enslavement. You mentioned earlier that one of the ways that you work to refute this myth of New Yorkers as benevolent enslavers is to explore the physical, geographic, and emotional spaces that enslaved New Yorkers occupied. Could you tell us a bit more about this idea that enslaved people were truly part of New York families, that they were members of New York families? What was the reality of this situation? Were enslaved New Yorkers truly part of white New York families?
One of the things that I looked at is, for example, the homes in which they lived. So one part, as James Fenimore Cooper also says, is they lived within our homes, and that somehow made them part of the same family. But when you go to these homes and you really explore the spaces in which the enslaved people lived and worked and compare that to their enslavers, it's absolutely very different. I can give you the example of Schuyler Mansion, for instance, that when you visit Schuyler Mansion, which now is in Albany, New York, and then it was just outside of Albany, when you enter the mansion, I mean, it's gorgeous. It has a large hallway, high ceilings, high windows, lots of natural light coming in. It's a beautiful space, a big stairwell going up to the second floor. And then if you look at where the enslaved people lived, most of them really would not have entered those spaces. They would have been in the back of the home. Very likely, the majority of them would have been sleeping in the cellar of Schuyler Mansion. Some of them may have been in the attic, but several records refer to them being in the cellar. They would have been going down narrow stairwells to go into that cellar. They would have been working in walled courtyards that really contained their movements, that contained their labor, that in some ways also hid that labor from any guests. And then there was the office of Philip Schuyler, who, of course, was the owner of this home. So this home was built in the 1760s by the Schuyler family. Philip Schuyler, having been a general in the American Revolution, a state legislator, and so forth, very prominent New Yorker. It's a Georgian-style home, so beautiful space. The courtyard would have been walled. That's where the enslaved people would have been working. And his office was in that courtyard. And also there were windows from the back of the Schuyler mansion that would have given a view of that courtyard. And so that shows how there were these ways of actually monitoring the activities and behavior of these enslaved people. So their experiences physically, but also, how they would have experienced that space with the constant surveillance would have been very different. Another example of a home that's very different, but also a kind of a common construction in New York, is the Lott House, which is today in Brooklyn, New York. And that home, initially, it was built by the Lott family, Dutch descendants, built in the 1730s. Initially, it was a saltbox-style home, which is a one-room building with a second floor that is an attic. And that would have been the sleeping quarters of the Lott family. They added a lean-to that soon after, and that lean-to held a kitchen and a very small garret space that really was so small that for the longest time, people did not realize in recent times that anybody could have lived there until somebody discovered that there was a little stairwell going up there. That was the area where the enslaved people lived. And that space, that garret space, had no natural light. You could not stand up in those spaces, very small. At some point, the Lott family enslaved about 11 people, and they may have all been living in those spaces. So it physically, very different experiences from the people that enslaved them, even though they lived in the same house. But then, of course, there's also more the symbolism of a home. Like we all think of our homes in some ways as spaces of domesticity, of family, of safety. For enslaved people, that would not have been the case. Those were spaces of enslavement. These were the places where they were forced to labor. These were the places where oftentimes they were separated from their families, where they were abused, neglected. So it also was a very different way of experiencing those spaces on an emotional level.
We're really talking about homes that never felt like home to the enslaved. We're talking about attic spaces, garret spaces, cellar spaces, kitchen spaces, and these dark, dank, cramped spaces are where the enslaved lived in New York. They saw bedrooms, perhaps even really nice bedrooms, as in the case of Schuyler Mansion, but they never actually got to sleep in one.
Yes, that's true. And Sojourner Truth actually describes one of those cellars that she lived in. So she grew up in a Dutch community in what today is Ulster, New York. And she, as a young girl, lived with one of her siblings, her brother, and her father and mother in one of those basements of the Hardenberg family, Charles Hardenberg. And she describes this cellar as being cold, muggy, no natural light. Yet she also, because I think that is an important part, like you're referencing in a way that they would have had very little privacy, very uncomfortable spaces. Yet we do see that they're able to create some form of sometimes autonomy in those spaces or family life in those spaces. And Sojourner Truth describes that, I think, very well when she talks about her parents, sitting with them outside under the stars as they talk about family members that had been taken away from them, the ways that they're sitting in the cellar around a candle or blaze knot and tell stories about loved ones and such. So there is a way that they try to create some sense of family and safety, but it is always an uphill battle, I think.
Within the context of this myth that we've been discussing, it's really interesting that Sojourner Truth's family was reminiscing about family members who had been taken away from them. Because, of course, another part of this myth of New York being a place where benevolent enslavers existed is that New York enslavers didn't separate families. They kept enslaved families intact as much as possible. They did their level best to do this. And yet if you have Sojourner Truth talking about family members who were taken away from them, it doesn't sound like this was the reality of slavery in New York.
Not at all. Not at all. Even when we think about the fact that in most cases, there were only a few people who lived in these homes. Most enslavers enslaved up to 5 people. So it wouldn't even have been possible to keep families together. But it's very common to see in wills, for example, families being divided amongst the different family members, sometimes children that are not even born yet. I've seen a will that said, my daughter will get all the children from my enslaved woman, even those who are not yet born. So it was very common. And I've seen many bills of sales of children as young as 1 or 2 years old. Going back to Sojourner Truth, she talks about this, I think, in a very vivid way when she describes what happens to her and her brother when their enslaver passes away. At that point, she's about 8 years old. And she describes later on in her narrative, she narrates that she often finds her mother, after her enslaver passed away, finds her mother like crying, really being very emotional. And at some point she asks her, "Mama, what's wrong?" And her mother says to her that she's thinking about the children that they had lost. And I believe that there were in total 8 children. So Sojourner Truth would have had lost at least 6 siblings at that point. So her mother talks about this as, the children that had been taken away from them, that she was overcome with emotion thinking about them. But what Sojourner Truth realizes in reflecting on this is that really her mother understood that the last 2 children she still had by her side would soon be separated from her with the death of her enslaver. And this is in fact what happened not long after Sojourner Truth and her brother are sold at the auction block. And her parents then lose the very last children they still had by their side. So this is something that enslaved people in New York understood could happen to them anytime. And it happened. Every single day, families were separated in New York.
Andrea, you've vividly described for us the spaces where enslaved people lived, worked, and even worshipped. Garrets, attics, cellars, the back pews in churches. And you've reminded us that white New Yorkers constantly surveilled their enslaved people, that movement was restricted, and they really didn't have much privacy while they were living in white New Yorkers' homes. And when we speak with scholars about enslavement and slavery, they often discuss how enslaved people used their conditions and their work to resist their enslavement. Even if it was just in small ways, there was resistance. Did you find evidence to suggest that enslaved New Yorkers also used their spaces and their conditions of enslavement to rebel against the system, to rebel against and resist their enslavement?
Yes, we see lots of resistance in New York. Some of it is more outright resistance, where enslaved people are running away or either attempt to murder their enslavers or do so. A very famous case is of the Hallett murder, where an enslaved man and woman killed their master, his wife, who was pregnant at the time, and all of their children. This is a case that really shocks the people in the area, especially in Long Island. It actually even ends up in New York legislative law as the reason why they need more restrictions on enslaved people's movements and activities. And we also see the more subtle resistance, the more every day-to-day resistance. And some of that would be the way that enslaved people moved through the cities, for example. So in New York, there's pretty strict legislation on what enslaved people can do. Over the course of the 18th century, really starting in the latter part of the 17th century, we see that the legislators prohibit enslaved people from traveling from point A to B without a pass. They're no longer allowed to purchase trade in goods, to purchase alcohol, to gather in groups of more than 4. Many different things they're restricted from doing, yet they still do these things, obviously. There are patrols, there is surveillance, there are different ways that these enslavers try to control the activities of enslaved people in these spaces. But what we see happening is that enslaved people then actually navigate the cities, for example, in different ways than their enslavers would. They travel via alleyways, backyards. They time their movements according to the schedule of the watchman. So one document that I found in the records that really gave a great example of this was Betts, who was enslaved in Albany, New York, and was accused of having set fire to Hansefort's house. And this actually devastated a whole part of Albany, the Albany fire in the 1790s. And she's accused of having set on fire, and she actually confesses to doing this. In her confession, she explains how she and the other two people that set this home on fire, according to her confession, Pomp and Diane, how they moved through the city without being seen, how they were able to do so by going via the alleyways, by actually hiding in the kitchen of one of the enslavers. And kitchens, because those were predominantly the work and living spaces of enslaved people, oftentimes they were able to create those as semi-autonomous spaces, especially in the evenings and the nights when their enslavers were in bed. And so they were able to travel through that city without being seen. And it's interesting when you look at the records, you can see that legislators know this. Like, they refer to enslaved people actually selling goods in outhouses, in backyards. They know that these activities are happening, but it's very difficult for them to stop that. And we also see within the homes, enslaved people are practicing religions that, are outside of the churches, the established churches in the areas. They hide the evidence of this. There's in the lot house and those garret spaces that I mentioned previously, they actually, under the floorboards, archaeologists found evidence of religious practices and ways to safeguard that space through really traditions that are very much part of African religions and the African diaspora. One item they found was a cloth pouch that contained an oyster shell and a goat or sheep's pelvis, which likely was placed there to safeguard that space, and is very reminiscent of similar caches that are being found in the US South and are used in places like West Central Africa or the Senegambia. So there's different ways that enslaved people are really resisting within those spaces. And even when those spaces are contained and controlled and surveilled, they find ways to avoid that surveillance. So in the Lot house, the Lot family very likely would not have entered that garret space and certainly would not have looked under the floorboard. So that was a way to be able to continue those practices hidden from their enslavers.
Your description of resistance reminded me of a question I had while I was reading your book, Spaces of Enslavement. You have a section in your book where you analyze ads for runaway enslaved people, those who self-emancipated. And when I read this section, I wondered where fugitives from slavery ran to, because in the 17th and 18th centuries, there weren't any free states yet. There weren't free colonies, places without enslavement. And the places that we call cities in colonial America, well, they weren't really all that large. I mean, take Albany, for example. I happen to know around 1760, it had a population of about 3,500 people. So we're not talking about really large spaces where people could blend in and try to hide from enslavers. So where did these fugitives from slavery find safe haven? Where did they run away to that they thought they'd be safe?
So it really depends. One thing we see frequently is that the people that are looking for them believe that they ran to family members. So in those cases, they actually very likely were in the region still, but really fleeing to be with family. We also see references to them, especially in the aftermath of the American Revolution, fleeing to the free areas, Massachusetts after 1784. Before that, places like New Hampshire are areas that enslaved people clearly know. And if you think of a place like Albany, New York, Massachusetts is really not that far away. So that became an area where we see some of them try to escape to. During the colonial period, there's some references of people trying to flee to New France or to the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois nations. And then in many of these ads, there's also references to them potentially hiding on board ships. So that, of course, is also another option of trying to escape permanently from the region, is by hiding on ships and that way being able to get out of the area. But what I think is so important about this is that we see from these ads that enslaved people really understand the geopolitical circumstances and understand the region very, very well. And they know where they can go, how they can get there. There's actually several cases of them bringing guns with them. So they also, know how to access those, get those, and take them with them as part of their protection. So I think that is a really important part of understanding that in many cases, this wasn't a spur of the moment running away. Oftentimes, they really had a plan. Sometimes family members who met to flee together. So they were enslaved by different people, but had made some sort of a strategy to meet and run away together. So they really understood the landscape and how they might be able to obtain their freedom.
Andrea, is there one aspect of slavery or enslavement in early New York, or perhaps even in the broader Dutch Atlantic world, that you'd really like for us to understand and walk away with?
One thing that I think is very important is obviously that we have a better understanding of slavery in New York as not being a benign system in some way, and that it becomes more included in the studies of slavery, as I would say for all of the northern regions. I mean, as I mentioned previously, New York had slavery for 200 years. That's a very long time period. Europeans enslaved Africans in New York almost a century longer than Europeans did in Georgia. Yet we still think of Georgia when we think of enslavement in the North, and less often we think of New York. And so I'd really like people to include New York and places like New York when they think about slavery and study slavery. I also think it's important, thinking about the Dutch Atlantic world. I would really like people to understand that the Dutch were very prominent when it came to the transatlantic slave trade, very active. Oftentimes, the Dutch are portrayed as being focused on commerce, as being very tolerant. And when you look at the records closely, that's really not the case. They're very territorial, and they use enslaved labor not just to develop their colonies, but also as a part of commerce. For example, as you noted earlier, using enslaved people to sell them to Spanish colonies and making money off the actual trade of human beings, of human trafficking. So I think that those are some of the things that are important, that deserve more attention.
And now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, Andrea, what might have happened if early New Yorkers had built separate quarters for their enslaved people? How might the experience of slavery in early New York have been different if enslaved people really had their own homes and dedicated spaces?
So this is a hard question, but I think one of the things that may have been different is that enslaved people would have had more opportunities even to gather, to kind of create some semi-autonomous spaces. When you look at these homes that they lived in, not only were these very small spaces, but many of these homes also, it was very difficult to move through them without other people hearing you. It would be very difficult to communicate in them without other people hearing you. And so I imagine that if more enslaved people in New York would have lived in separated homes, separate buildings, that would have given them a little bit more of an opportunity to leave these houses unnoticed, to travel the streets unnoticed. So even though they already did that, I think it would have been more so the case. And it also probably would have given them then more opportunities to meet with family and friends, loved ones whom lived in different households in different parts of the cities, because they would have had these spaces that when their enslavers were abed, they could perhaps have spent some time together unnoticed.
So you've curated a digital exhibit, you've written Spaces of Enslavement, and you're an award-winning educator. What is next for you, Andrea? Do you even have time for a new research project?
I'm working hard on it, Liz. I'm very excited. I cannot wait to really start working on this. I'm looking at the Dutch slaver, the Gideon, which arrived in New Amsterdam just before the English took over the colony. And it brought 290 enslaved people to the area. It was a West India Company ship. These enslaved people, actually part of a great number of them, were supposed to go to the Delaware, to the colony there. At that point, actually, it was part of New Netherlands, but was under the control of the city of Amsterdam. And what I hope to do with this project is to really reconstruct this history of this particular slave ship, the people that worked on the ship, the people that built the ship, that provisioned the ship, the journey it took. It traveled via Curacao, for example, where some of these people that were brought on board in West Central Africa were exchanged for people already in Curacao, because the people that arrived in Curacao on board the Gideon were so incredibly ill and weak from predominantly scurvy that they simply would not have survived the final leg to New Amsterdam. So it gives me an opportunity to look more closely at that development of Curacao as a slave depot. It gives me the opportunity to look at really the African side of things. I worked with Africanists. I'm fascinated with pre-colonial African history. And so I'm very excited to be able to explore the developments there in places like the Kingdom of Congo and Elmina, the Dutch at that point controlled. So that's my next project. And of course, it's very exciting too, because it's right before the English take over. And Peter Stuyvesant actually blames the Gideon and the poor condition of the people on board the Gideon in part for the English success in taking over the colony, because he said that all the provisions had to go to these enslaved people instead of the soldiers, something that James Baldwin later on refers to. So there's so many layers to this story, and I cannot wait to really dig into it. So more to come.
If we have more questions about slavery in early New York, how can we best get a hold of you?
So people can email me at my university email address. It can be found on the University of New Orleans website. I also have my own webpage. I believe it's AndreaCMosterman.com. If you Google me, it'll pop up. So that's another way of finding me. And there's a contact button there as well. So you could also use that to send me a message. So yes, please feel free to reach out. I always love hearing from people who are either reading my book or who have questions about slavery in New York. So don't hesitate.
Andrea Mosterman, thank you for helping us explore New Netherland and early New York and its practice of slavery.
Thank you for having me. It was really wonderful. I've been a fan for a long time, so it was great to finally be on your show.
Even in our 21st century, stories about benign places of enslavement continue to exist. However, as Andrea pointed out to us, nothing about the institution of slavery was ever benign. And I think this is something we really had a chance to see during our conversation with Andrea. New Yorkers have long claimed that their colony and state was home to a benign practice of slavery. And they made this case because they argued New York enslavers brought enslaved people into their homes and supposedly incorporated these enslaved people into their families. But as Andrea related to us, this idea isn't the full truth. Yes, New York enslavers brought enslaved people into their homes, but these enslaved people were never part of white New York families. While white New Yorkers slept in beds and bedrooms, enslaved people lived in cramped attic spaces and dark, muggy cellars. White eyes followed enslaved people wherever they went, which is why enslaved New Yorkers had to become adept at working within and working around the very tight restrictions imposed on their movements and activities. Many enslaved New Yorkers also lacked community life. They felt isolated. Although they lived and worked around white people all day, unless enslaved New Yorkers lived and worked in New York City or perhaps 19th century Albany, other settlements were just too small and too scattered for enslaved people to form what we would think of as a vigorous community life. And then there was always the threat of family separation. Andrea told us about Sojourner Truth. Truth and her youngest brother were sold away from their parents after the death of their enslaver. And for Truth's parents, this marked the sale of all their children. So was New York a place where a benevolent form of slavery existed? Not at all. It was home to a different type of slavery than we would see practiced on the plantations of the South or in the Caribbean. And for many, it was a different form of slavery than what was practiced in early America's more urban communities. Like all places of enslavement, New York was home to a harsh, abusive, and sometimes violent practice. You'll find more information about Andrea, her book, Spaces of Enslavement, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/324. Also on the show notes page, you'll find a link to Andrea's digital exhibit, Slavery in New Netherland, and a link for one of the New Netherland Institute's video productions about the Black experience in Dutch New York. Please tell your friends and family about Ben Franklin's World. Your word-of-mouth support helps the show reach new listeners, and I always love meeting new listeners. This episode of Ben Franklin's World is supported by an American Rescue Plan grant to the Omohundro Institute from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Martha Howard, and Holly White. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, are there any other aspects of the Dutch Atlantic world that you would like to investigate? Tell me, Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.